Welcome to Talk Back. Today we will be discussing the most controversial aspect of the WTO regime, linking of trade policy with labor standards and what impact this has on developing countries such as India. To discuss this emotionally charged issue of trade and labor standards, I have with me here Dr. Subramanian Swamy and Dr. Surjit Bhalla. Dr. Swamy was Commerce Minister in the Government of India in 1990-91. He was also the chairman of the Commission on Labour Standards that was set up by the Government of India in 1994-96. He is known as a political activist, but what is not so well known is the fact that he has recently written a book on labour standards and the WTO framework as it pertains to India. Dr. Surjit Bhalla is President, Oxus Research and Investments. We are all familiar with his writings in financial newspapers and other magazines. Welcome. Now, Dr. Swamy, there has been so much controversy over labor standards and what the developed countries are doing to developing countries via the labor standards. Shall we start with you defining for our viewers what exactly is meant by labor standards in the WTO context?
Well, before the WTO was set up, the ILO has been in existence since 1919, and they have adopted 182 conventions. And during the formation of the WTO and the discussions preceding it, there was an international consensus developed that of these 182, 7 of them should be treated as basic human rights standards, and slowly those 7 conventions dealing with freedom of association, collective bargaining, banning of child labor, forced labor, non-discrimination, gender equality, etc. These 7 conventions are what is called as the core standards, and when people talk about labor standards and its within the framework of the WTO, they're talking about these 7 conventions of the ILO.
As defined in the ILO.
Yes.
But Surjit, if ILO was already trying to see that these conventions are ratified and accepted by all the countries, what is the need for the WTO to get into the act?
Well, that's the $64,000, we should say a crore question. And I think the answer is more political than economic. The US, which is the main originator of the idea that the WTO should get involved, feels for various reasons it does not have that much influence in the ILO. So they're trying to use this as a lobbying vehicle. I think it's all political. There is no logical place for it to be in the WTO. As Dr. Swamy said, the ILO has been pushing for these things, and a lot of them have been ratified, including by Government of India. They've been pushing it for 80 years. The WTO is a Johnny-come-lately, but it is backed by the US.
And is it also not true that in Singapore, the Singapore Ministerial had agreed that the WTO and the ILO secretariats would be working together on core labor standards? But now, Dr. Swamy, there is this effort that was made at Seattle and in preparations for Seattle that you will actually link trade sanctions with labor standards. Now, do you think that that is correct?
Well, in 1994, when the WTO, the new GATT agreement was brought into force by signature, there was a agreement that the question of incorporating labor standards in WTO framework would be discussed, and it was discussed in the Singapore meeting that you mentioned, and it is that which was taken forward by President Clinton in Seattle. Now the question is, why has ILO been effective in enforcing these labor standards? And the answer is no, it has not. And therefore, can we bring in some punitive aspects, punitive measures, by which countries would feel compelled to enforce these labor standards? And that's the device in the WTO called cross-retaliation, which means that if you don't implement labor standards, if they become part of the WTO, then the most favored nation clause or the trade access that you have would be denied to you. So even though it has nothing to do with your trade practices, because your internal practice of not maintaining labor standards, you will lose the trade privileges that you are entitled to under the WTO. And I think the experience of the ILO demonstrates to me that if you leave it within the ILO, and the way it is, the tripartite structure of the ILO will either collapse or it will not be able to enforce it. The only enforcing treaty that we have today is the GATT 1994, and that means the WTO can utilize the cross retaliation.
Surjit, they say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Do you believe that these are good intentions on the part of the developed countries, that they want to take punitive actions if we don't meet labor standards set by the WTO?
Well, nobody ever made any money betting on good intentions on the part of the developed countries, or for that matter, developing countries. And as you said, it's the surest way to hell, and if not to your own profitability, and not to any kind of a social good whatsoever. But, you know, what Dr. Swamy said, I mean, he's contradicting himself in several ways. And the first thing he said, you know, ILO is not effective. Therefore, I presume that we should now have banned the UN, you know, but let's link peace agreements and border forces, everything with trade, because we all recognize trade is important. So let's ban everything else and bring it in the WTO. I mean, I don't think he would subscribe to that, but if he does, I'd like to hear it. The other thing in his very well-written book, and I would recommend it to the viewers, he points out in elaborate detail how within India, the labor standards cannot, and he emphasizes, italicized it, all measures are used to show that these things cannot be enforced. You have to create an enabling environment such that child labor, for example, is not there, which is something that I completely agree with. But now he's saying, no, let's use trade. I mean, I don't understand. Either he believes that an enabling environment is what is critical, and he says that in his book, or this part. So that's why I think that he's really contradicting himself, and I don't get a message as to what he really wants.
Surjit, if I understand you correctly, what you mean by enabling environment is that if you really have a family which is very poor, and they can't really feed their children.
Give them income.
Then they have to resort to child labor. So the thing to do is to get rid of poverty, create conditions in which people can send their children to school rather than go into the arms of the WTO.
And that's what Dr. Swamy himself says. So I want to know
what would be your answer to that?
Well, first of all, there's no contradiction. I think he is not perhaps either read my book in the depth I would have liked to see him have read it. First of all, the labor standards is not yet a part of the new GATT agreement, and therefore the WTO is not in the picture. If you bring labor standards into the new GATT, then you must also build in certain enabling clauses. I am not saying that these standards must be implemented right away. Some of them India has already incorporated in its constitution. Freedom of association. It's not there in China. It's not there in Indonesia. It's not there in a whole host of developing
countries we like to compare ourselves with.
Yes, developing countries. Now, there is no reason for India to be their advocate. We are in a privileged position that our democratic constitution has in fact already incorporated into law a number of the basic labor standards. The question would then become that once it becomes part of the WTO purview, then you may say in 10 years from now you have to implement, like we did in 1994. The tariffs were to be reduced, not immediately, but in 2001, then the textiles in 2004. Consequently, I would not like anything to be implemented right away because there will be chaos. But I do think that they should put a timetable. I also think that the developed countries, which show so much moral outrage in child labor and other things, they should share the cost. And as a commission chairman, when I went around the country investigating, I found that the only reason why people were not sending their children to school was because the school was not immediately accessible. If you were to build, with the help of the new online education system, the access to education and a certain amount of confidence that once they got better education, they would get a job. Today there is also the cynicism, what's the use of this education when you're not going to get a job? Then I think child labor will go. But morally speaking, it is wrong for children to be in the fields and in the factories than in the schools. They should belong to the school, and long run economic growth is protected if you send your children to schools.
Yeah, we should be clear as to what, I absolutely agree and endorse 100% what Dr. Swamy has just said. And we should be clear where the disagreement is. And the disagreement is what we started off with as to whether the WTO should basically link trade sanctions with so-called Western labor standards. And I should also point out, and in that disagreement, is Dr. Swamy himself, I did read it somewhat carefully, it was page 184, he says that the social clause, which is what we are talking about, he says that there are various non-trade considerations. So he emphasizes that the social clause is non-trade. Then why are we linking it with trade?
See,
I come back to my normal first question.
Dr.
Why not
Swamy,
ban the UN? Why not ban all things and just keep everything in WTO?
But Dr. Swamy, if I may put the same question a little differently,
right.
Many people feel that what we saw on the streets of Seattle were basically steel workers and the trade unions in the United States, AFL-CIO. Now, should they be setting labor standards for us?
They are not setting labor standards. In fact, their fear is that the real fear is the new GATT agreement, where they think they would lose their jobs. So they're using this as an excuse.
Exactly.
And
why should we allow them to?
Yes, precisely. But at the same time, I would say that we do need to meet these basic labor standards.
Of course.
Yes.
Our NGOs are working on that.
Yes, and the way to do it is to fix a time period, and then have a punitive clause, which the ILO doesn't have and its charter cannot provide for. The only charter that can provide for today is not the UN, it's the WTO. Now, why
do you want an external punitive clause? In a democracy, can't our NGOs make the government...
Where human rights are concerned, I think we have all agreed that they are cross-border. But let me just respond to his other point that let's close down the UN, let's put everything in WTO. Where we are, as far as the economic matters are concerned, the way things are going, we have brought in environment already, we have brought in patent laws already, now we are bringing labor standards. I think over a period of time, WTO will emerge as the omnibus economic body for the world, and the UN should be a political body.
Well, thank you. Stay with us. We will be back after this break. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of Talkback. This evening we have as our guest
Welcome back. We resume our discussion on the linking of labor standards with trade sanctions. Dr. Swamy, there are a lot of people in developing countries who feel that on the one hand, the developed countries are asking us to lower our tariff barriers, but on the other, when we are getting ready to compete and we flood their markets with cheap labor products, they are putting up non-tariff barriers in the form of labor standards. Don't you think there is a contradiction there?
Well, I think we have to come to a basic understanding whether we have to follow the same paths which these developed countries followed in order to become developed. In that case, then we should go through aristocracy before adopting democracy. If we do accept today an international consensus that certain basic human rights have to be translated in economic terms, then I think there should be in principle an agreement on these core standards. And then, having had this principal agreement, we can have a sequencing, we can have a time phasing for it, in which the developed countries should participate in sharing the burden of the transition. There is a transition cost, and that transition cost should be shared by them. For example, for child labor, to enable a school system where parents feel that it's worthwhile to send their children to school. It'll cost 65,000 crores for India over a period of 10, 15 years. And if the developed countries are not ready to wait 15, 20 years, which we can afford for over that period, then they should fund a substantial portion of that. Now, there is no reason for India to position itself with the rest of the developing countries, because we are totally different. We don't have prison labor like China has. We don't have widespread use of child labor as Indonesia and Thailand has. In fact, we should be proud of our democratic constitution, and we should be in fact try to be the mediator between North and South countries on this issue, and try to harmonize the implementation.
He's absolutely right that as far as child labor goes, as far as prison labor goes, as far as basic human rights go, that's ultimately the issue. We have been the leaders, we have been the pioneers, and we should use that as a basis for not necessarily agreeing with the West, on which we share the human rights values, but for being objective. Being objective on this issue means that there is no logical basis for linking the Western concept of standards to trade.
Now, you said that, we should use this punitive action to goad us into doing better.
That's right.
But tell me, if you are an exporter from India and you are exporting a product to a developed country and you don't quite meet their labor standards, and tomorrow they turn around and say, no, we ban your export, they affect your development activity. How does that help you to enhance your labor standards in your country?
Now, they cannot talk about those issues until a certain period is elapsed. We certainly must not export products which use child labor.
But who's determining?
When? Yeah, that's by negotiation. When?
But I mean,
when
some babus will get together and decide.
Well, I'm sorry, in a parliamentary democracy, babus are not supposed to get together and decide.
Who is supposed? Some politicians get together and decide.
Yes.
Even worse.
I'm sorry, that is the system we have. The question is, if you're going to link it, how is it going to be linked? When is it going to be linked? But without that punitive sanction, never we will give up child labor.
I want to ask you,
I'm not saying why it should be linked. That's the basic objection.
Surjit,
Not how.
I want to ask you a question. If we go towards labor standards on which everybody is agreed, then why not go for labor mobility?
Our government has not argued on this at all. Immigration should be a part of labor standards. Free movement across the globe should be part of it. And that should be part of your negotiations.
Let me, look, the reason perhaps the Indian government did not waste time on asking for this, a noble issue, again, on which theoretically everybody is in agreement, it's like motherhood, the chances of that are higher, just marginally higher than hell freezing over tomorrow. There is no chance of that happening. So what's the point of going around and around? We should have this, we should have this, everybody should do it,
Swamy,
and everybody. We're talking about something that is being imposed. We saw what action they could take in the Seattle. We saw what chaos it would cause. These are the very same, the AFL-CIO people who are at the vanguard of preventing any kind of immigration, and we should support them on something like this. Absolutely. We should support them if they support us. On this, both of those issues you agree are important. Why should we support them on one and not get the support of the other?
Let me pose another question. Now, within Europe, there is this tendency to synchronize their economic policies because they are coming together as an economic market. Now, they have this concept called deep integration. There I can understand that you talk about labor standards because you are going from trade policies to financial policies to same air that you breathe and the same labor standards that you aspire to. But if you are going to really put up huge walls to keep these countries out from your basic, field in which you operate, then why should we look at labor standards?
You see, this duality that exists in India leads to a double think. In the organized sector in India, we already have labor standards. There's no child labor. Child labor is in the unorganized sector. So in India, we have two worlds. One where labor enjoys all the American labor standards. And the unorganized sector, which there is the cruelest form of child labor, where I've seen girls go and do 18 hours of work, traveling hours and hours on to a factory far away. Now, in order to put a stop to that, there must be a mechanism. You have to have a timetable, and you say that we will abolish it by such a date.
I think all three of us are agreed that we should have a timetable, we should move towards that. The only question is, should it not be done within a civil society framework, within our own democratic framework? Why should
it may ultimately work to your advantage in the trading community later on?
Because we are in a barriers.
Position. Well, they are barriers for our competitors. I don't understand why you should think that we are a homogeneous developing society. The developing countries constitute a homogeneous society. In fact, India would have great advantages if tomorrow social clause were made a part and we got some amount of time to implement it. I think we will steal a march over China, we'll steal a march over most of the Asian tigers, and we would be, in fact, be greatly benefited. I don't understand why we should put ourselves in this crowd where we don't belong.
I want to emphasize as to where my strong disagreement is. I mean, the agreement is very obvious. I think we can steal a march on East Asia, we can steal a march on China, etc. All of those things, I think, we can be done. None of them have whatsoever to do with the child labor issue and the linking of labor standards with the WTO. I mean, these are nonsense. These are not related to this fundamental point. By arguing that we should steal a march and by arguing for good things and for motherhood, where you'll get everybody to agree, including myself, and on which I substantially agree on, doesn't detract or detracts from the basic issue over here, is should we link it to trade sanctions or the possibility of trade sanctions? Yes. And there the answer has to be an overwhelming no. You have not given one logical argument of why it should be done. You can't refer to we should go at 9% unless you argue that by abolishing and by going along with the US and the WTO, we will be able to grow at 9%.
Higher labor standards will produce a faster economic growth after a certain period.
I agree. You yourself has just pointed out on China, they have grown at 10-12% a year without labor standards. In fact, the opposite. So I guess you would be saying that they had adopted labor standards would be growing at 20%.
Well, what we should come to an agreement is, he is not arguing what I'm arguing. He is posing that I am saying that labor standards should be linked to trade sanctions right away. I never said so. You want never to link labor standards with trade sanctions.
Absolutely.
That's your stand.
Yes. Yeah.
That's not my stand. My stand is, yes, you must link it. India stands to gain by it, and this is morally correct thing to do. Without these trade sanctions, we will not be able to abolish child labor. No one will take it seriously. What has happened is the ILO has passed 182 conventions. The world over, only 25% of it has been ratified. In fact, you should go back to the United States and say you have only ratified 11 labor standards of the ILO, of the 182. We have ratified 38. And it is, in fact, we should put pressure. And I also agree with you that we should bring in issues which are part of this core labor standards, that is free movement of labor.
And there is if
you can have free movement of capital, you can certainly have free movement of labor.
Whether or not we bring labor standards with trade linkage under the WTO, the truth is that more and more private companies are shunning products which use child labor, which use labor standards which are below par. So we get that pressure. We get the market pressure anyway to, so which again supports the point that Surjit is making. Why do we then need to go over and above that to the WTO?
Because it needs to be regulated. It needs to be regulated. In fact, you have made a very important point that now that since the social clause has not come, companies are not buying. For instance, Tirupur near Coimbatore, they have stopped buying woolen hosiery from there because they say it's made by child labor. They are already implementing that, and they will continue to do so. The United States will use its influence with its companies and they will do that. Therefore, I am saying that in order not to let them do it unilaterally, you commit them to be part of an agreement, and you commit them to commit funds for the transformation.
You know, these very same Americans, China enjoys about a $60 billion trade surplus with the U.S. for each year, for each of the last 7-8 years. And, you know, these Americans, these very, very nice, well-meaning Americans, somehow haven't quite put a restriction on the toys being made from China, which they are getting at cheap prices, which their kids are using. So let's not get the hypocrisy of the West.
I would say, no, I think...
I want to emphasize this very same thing about...
They'll choose their own time. They're not going to choose
firms will not be allowed to do so if the WTO does not. In other words, the WTO will have to act against these very same firms. So, come on, we can't really go and fall into that trap.
I said to our viewers this was an emotionally charged issue, and indeed it has been. I think the message that comes out very clearly is that we need core labor standards and more for our own sake. The only question is whether to link it with trade issues under the WTO or not. Thank you. Stay with us. Next week, same time, same day, we'll be back discussing more aspects of the WTO as it impacts on the Indian economy. Thank you.